My fiancé, Liam, squeezed my hand under the mahogany dining table, his thumb rubbing slow, deliberate circles over my knuckles. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered the 5 words that would detonate my entire world. They're not just bad with money. I looked across the table at my beaming parents and my brother, Dylan, who was regaling them with some story about his latest European vacation, a trip I had helped finance with a loan I was told was a matter of life and death. Their laughter echoed in the cavernous dining room of the house I had also helped save from foreclosure twice. I felt the familiar acidic churn of resentment in my stomach, the one I had been taught to swallow my whole life. But Liam's words hung in the air, a poisonous little seed of doubt. And that seed would later save us. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. My family operated on a very specific, unspoken set of rules. Rule 1. Dylan was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets, orbiting his brilliance, his needs, his latest drama. Rule 2. Evelyn, that's me, was the family's resident ATM, therapist and crisis manager, available 24/7 with no benefits and a perpetually renewable contract of guilt. Rule 3. And the most important one, don't talk about the rules. For years, I just assumed this was how families worked. I was the responsible one, a title bestowed upon me around the age of 8, when I started managing my own piggy bank with more fiscal sense than my parents managed their entire portfolio. This title was a crown made of lead, heavy and toxic. It meant that when my dad's sure-thing investment in an emu farm went belly up, it was 10-year-old me who surrendered my savings for a new bike to help keep the lights on. It meant that when my mom decided to launch a high-end, organic, gluten-free dog biscuit company with zero business plan, it was college-aged me who drained my scholarship fund to buy her a commercial-grade oven. The biscuits, by the way, were apparently so organic that they molded within 24 hours. My brother Dylan was exempt from all of this. His role was to be charming, to have potential. His potential was a bottomless pit into which my parents threw money, affection, and endless second chances. My accomplishments were met with a distracted nod. Dylan's ability to simply exist was grounds for a ticker-tape parade. I was told I was the strong one, which I later learned is family code for the one we can exploit without feeling bad about it. The narrative was that I was practical, grounded, and good with money. While they were all just passionate dreamers, my practicality was the safety net that allowed them to leap from one disastrous dream to the next. I paid for Dylan's first car, a sporty little convertible he wrapped around a telephone pole 3 weeks later. I co-signed on his first apartment, which he was evicted from for non-payment after hosting what the landlord described as a small-scale music festival. Each time, my parents would sit me down, their faces a perfect blend of sorrow and disappointment, and explain the situation with practiced ease. Dylan was just finding himself. He was sensitive. The world was too harsh for a soul like his. And I, being the strong one, needed to help. They never asked, they informed. It was my duty, my role. The worst part is I believed them. I saw their financial incompetence, not as a character flaw, but as a charming, if frustrating, quirk. I saw Dylan's irresponsibility as artistic temperament. I saw my own constant sacrifices as the price of admission for a loving family. It took an outsider, someone who hadn't been slowly boiled in this pot of dysfunction, to point out that the water was scalding. Liam came into my life like a home inspector entering a house full of termites, asbestos, and faulty wiring that the owners have just gotten used to. He was calm, he was logical, and he loved me in a way that didn't come with an itemized invoice. He started noticing the little things first. The way my phone would blow up with emergencies that always seemed to coincide with my payday. The way my parents would praise my generosity in one breath and subtly mock my frugal lifestyle in the next. "It's so wonderful that you're not materialistic, Evelyn," my mother would say, while admiring the new designer handbag Dylan had bought her, likely with money I had loaned him for rent. Liam didn't say much at first, just watched with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He was gathering data, and the conclusion he was drawing was one I had spent 28 years refusing to see. The family I was sacrificing everything for wasn't just a group of lovable, chaotic dreamers. They were predators, and I was their chosen prey. Their love was a transaction, their praise a tool of manipulation. The night he whispered that warning at the dinner table was the first crack in the foundation, the first time I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. What if they weren't just bad with money? What if it was something worse? The family mythology was as elaborate as it was self-serving. My grandparents, my father's parents, were painted as frugal, hard-working people who had scrimped and saved their entire lives but had very little to show for it. They lived in a modest home, drove sensible cars, and their idea of a vacation was a weekend trip to a nearby lake. According to my father, they had left him just enough to cover their funeral expenses and a few outstanding medical bills. It was a sob story he trotted out every time one of his brilliant financial schemes imploded. "I wish my parents had been able to give me a leg up," he'd sigh, staring mournfully into his glass of whiskey, the expensive kind I'd bought for his birthday. "Not like some people, we've had to do it all on our own." This narrative conveniently ignored the fact that doing it all on their own primarily involved leveraging my income and my credit score. The story of their inherited poverty was the cornerstone of their financial victimhood. It was the excuse for everything: the credit card debt, the second mortgage, the constant, desperate need for infusions of my cash. It also served to make me feel guilty for my own financial stability, which I had achieved through meticulous saving, working 2 jobs through college, and living far below my means. My success wasn't a source of pride for them, it was a resource. My brother Dylan, of course, was the tragic hero of this mythology. He was the brilliant artist, the free spirit, who was constantly being held back by a cruel, unappreciative world that just didn't understand his genius. His inability to hold a job for more than a few months was framed as a noble rejection of corporate drudgery. His mounting pile of debt was the cost of pursuing his passion, a passion that seemed to change on a weekly basis, from artisanal cheesemaking to DJing to cryptocurrency day trading. My parents were the long-suffering patrons of his art, a role they played with theatrical anguish. They would speak in hushed, reverent tones about his potential, as if it were a delicate, priceless artifact that needed to be protected from the harsh realities of life, like paying rent or buying his own groceries. My role in this play was the stoic, uncomplaining stagehand. I was the one who made sure the lights stayed on and the stage didn't collapse while the stars of the show emoted. My pragmatism was useful, but it was seen as pedestrian, lacking the glamour of Dylan's chaotic brilliance. When I got a promotion at my accounting firm, my mother's response was, "Oh, that's nice, dear, more numbers." "You must be thrilled." When Dylan announced he was going to become a spoken-word poet, she wept with joy and hosted a dinner party in his honor. The gaslighting was an art form in their hands. Any attempt on my part to establish a boundary was met with a tidal wave of emotional manipulation. If I hesitated to hand over money, I was being selfish. "I guess we'll just have to sell the house," my father would say, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air, "and it will be your fault." If I questioned Dylan's latest harebrained scheme, I was being unsupportive. "Your brother needs our belief, Evelyn," my mum would lecture, her voice trembling with manufactured hurt. "I'm so disappointed that his own sister can't see his light." They had trained me from birth to accept this reality. They had groomed me to be the caretaker, the fixer, the one who would always put the family's needs above her own. It was a quiet, insidious form of abuse, one that leaves no visible bruises but hollows you out from the inside. I was conditioned to believe that this was love, that my constant state of financial and emotional depletion was the price of belonging. Liam was the first person to call it what it was. He saw the pattern because he wasn't part of the tapestry. He could see the ugly, knotted threads on the back that I had been taught to ignore. He started asking simple, devastating questions. Why are you the only one responsible for their financial well-being? Why is Dylan's comfort more important than your future? Have they ever once sacrificed anything for you? The questions were like stones thrown into the placid, murky pond of my denial. The ripples spread, and things I had refused to see started rising to the surface. It was painful, it was terrifying. But it was also the beginning of my awakening. The dinner where he whispered his warning was a turning point. It was Dylan's 30th birthday, and my parents had thrown him a lavish party at a restaurant I knew for a fact they couldn't afford. I had already given Dylan a generous check, but my mother had pulled me aside before we sat down, her eyes wide with panic. The caterer, the venue, it was all more than they expected. Could I just help them out a little? Just until their social security check came in. It was the same old song, a different verse. I had the checkbook in my purse, the pen in my hand, ready to sign away another piece of my future. Then I looked at Liam. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were holding mine, and in them I saw a reflection of myself that I didn't recognize. A fool. I put the checkbook away. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I can't." The shock on her face was comical. It was as if the ATM had suddenly started dispensing philosophy instead of cash. The rest of the dinner was tense. My parents were cold, my brother petulant, and in that chill, I felt the first unfamiliar warmth of power. Liam's words weren't just an observation, they were a key, and they had just unlocked the door to a cage I hadn't even realized I was in. The aftermath of the birthday dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. My mother began leaving me tearful voicemails about how disappointed she was, not in me, of course, but in herself for having clearly failed to raise a daughter who understood the meaning of family. My father took a different approach, sending me links to articles about the loneliness of old age and the importance of caring for one's elders. Dylan simply blocked me on all social media, a move of such juvenile theatricality that it would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. This was their standard operating procedure. Apply pressure from all sides until the weak point, me, buckled. For the first time in my life, I didn't. Liam became my shield and my sounding board. He listened patiently as I recounted years of slights, manipulations, and financial hemorrhages that I had always downplayed or explained away. He helped me connect the dots, to see that these weren't isolated incidents, but a calculated, long-term strategy of exploitation. We started piecing together a timeline, a grim accounting of all the money I had loaned them over the years. The numbers were staggering. Down payments, medical bills that were mysteriously never produced, seed money for businesses that never launched, rent for apartments Dylan was never in. It was enough to have bought a house, to have started my own family, to have built a life of my own, free from the crushing weight of their manufactured crises. "They're not just bad with money, Evelyn," Liam repeated one night, holding my hand as I stared at the spreadsheet we'd created, a monument to my own naivety. "People who are bad with money don't consistently end up with your money in their pockets. They're con artists, and their mark is their own daughter." The word con artist hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was such an ugly, definitive word. It felt wrong to apply it to my own parents, the people who had tucked me in at night, who had cheered at my graduation. But the evidence was undeniable. Their love had always been conditional. Their affection, a currency to be exchanged for my compliance and my cash. The more I pulled away, the more desperate their tactics became. My mother escalated from tearful voicemails to showing up at my office unannounced, weeping in the lobby about how she didn't know how they were going to make their mortgage payment. It was a public performance designed to shame me into submission. My boss, a kind, no-nonsense woman in her 60s, took one look at my ashen face and my mother's crocodile tears and promptly had security escort her out. "Don't you let them do this to you, Evelyn," she told me later, placing a cup of tea on my desk. "I've seen this script before. It doesn't end well for the ATM." The support from people like my boss and Liam was a revelation. I had always believed my family's narrative that our situation was unique, a special kind of messy that only I could manage. To hear outsiders recognize the patterns, to have my reality validated, was incredibly empowering. It was like I'd been living in a house with a severe gas leak my whole life, and someone had finally thrown open a window. The fresh air was dizzying. My father, realizing his subtle approach had failed, tried a more direct assault. He called me, his voice booming with righteous anger. He accused me of being brainwashed by Liam, of abandoning my family, of being a cold, heartless, selfish daughter. He recited a litany of all the things they had ever done for me, a list that was shockingly short and heavily embellished. "We gave you a roof over your head," he bellowed. "I let you use my car for your driving test." It was the desperate rage of a man whose primary resource was being cut off. He wasn't angry because he missed his daughter. He was angry because his cash cow was wandering out of the pasture. I listened to his tirade, and for the first time I didn't feel guilt or fear. I felt a profound, clarifying pity. He was a child in a man's body, throwing a tantrum because his favorite toy had been taken away. When he was finished, I took a breath and said, calmly and quietly, "I'm done, Dad." And then I hung up. That phone call was my declaration of independence. It was the moment I stopped being their safety net and started being my own person. It was terrifying, but it was also the most liberating moment of my life. I knew they would not go quietly, they would escalate. They would find new ways to manipulate, to threaten, to guilt. But something fundamental had shifted in me. I was no longer afraid of their disappointment. I was no longer willing to set myself on fire to keep them warm. I was finally, after 28 years, starting to understand the first rule of surviving a dysfunctional family. The only way to win is not to play. The silence that followed that phone call was deafening. Days turned into a week, then 2. No calls, no texts, no unannounced visits. It was the longest I had ever gone without one of their manufactured emergencies. It was an eerie, unsettling peace, like the quiet in the eye of a hurricane. Liam and I knew it was just a temporary ceasefire. They were regrouping, planning their next assault. We just didn't know what it would be, or how much worse it was about to get. The quiet lasted for exactly 1 month. Then came the letter. It was from a lawyer, a name I didn't recognize, on heavy, cream-colored stationery that screamed expensive. My hands trembled as I opened it. Liam read it over my shoulder, his arm a solid, comforting weight around me. It was a formal notice of eviction, from my own condo. The condo that I had bought and paid for, with my own name, as the sole owner on the deed. I read the document 3 times, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. It made no sense. It was impossible. Then I saw the attachment. It was a copy of a lease agreement, supposedly signed by me 2 years prior, leasing my condo to my parents for the sum of $1 a month for a term of 10 years. My signature was at the bottom, a near-perfect forgery. My blood ran cold. This was a level of deception, of malice, that I simply could not fathom. It wasn't just about money anymore. This was a calculated attempt to ruin me, to leave me homeless as punishment for my disobedience. "They can't do this," I whispered, the paper rattling in my hand. "This is fraud. This is a crime." "Yes, it is," Liam said, his voice grim. "And that's how we're going to fight it." The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls and meetings with a lawyer of my own, a sharp, empathetic woman named Ms. Albright. She examined the forged lease, her expression growing more and more grim. "This is a very good forgery, Evelyn," she admitted. "Your father must have had access to your signature on other documents, checks, letters." I thought of all the checks I had written them over the years, the endless stream of financial support. They had used my own generosity as a weapon against me. The thought was sickening. Ms. Albright explained our options. We could fight this in court, but it would be a long, ugly, and expensive process. A handwriting expert could likely prove the forgery, but it wasn't a guarantee. It would be my word against theirs, a daughter accusing her own parents of a felony. The thought of a public court battle, of airing my family's dirty laundry for the world to see, was nauseating. It was exactly what they wanted. A war of attrition that would drain my finances and my spirit, forcing me to crawl back to them, broken and compliant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the floor of the condo they were trying to steal from me, my mind racing. How could they do this? How could a parent do this to their child? I thought about my father's booming voice on the phone, the righteous indignation. He truly believed he was entitled to my life, my home, my future. He saw me not as a daughter, but as a failed investment that was refusing to pay out. The anger that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over into a cold, hard rage. They wanted a fight? Fine. They would get one, but I wasn't going to play by their rules. I wasn't going to let them drag me through a protracted legal battle designed to bleed me dry. I had to find another way. I had to find some leverage, something they didn't know I knew. I started thinking back, searching for cracks in the carefully constructed facade of their lives. I thought about the mythology of their poverty, the story of my grandparents leaving them with nothing. It had always been the foundation of their victimhood. What if it wasn't true? It was a wild, Desperate thought, a shot in the dark, but it was all I had. The next morning, I called my Aunt Carol, my father's estranged sister. We hadn't spoken in years. My parents had told me she was a bitter, unstable woman who had cut off the family over a petty inheritance dispute. Another part of the mythology, I was beginning to realize. Carol was hesitant at first, her voice guarded. But when I told her what was happening, about the forged lease and the eviction notice, the dam of her silence broke. She unleashed a torrent of stories, decades of resentment and hurt pouring out. She told me about my father's selfishness, his sense of entitlement, his long history of manipulating their parents. And then she said the words that would change everything. Your grandparents weren't poor, Evelyn, not by a long shot. They were just smart. They knew your father was a black hole for money. They set up a trust, a big one. Your father and Dylan were the sole beneficiaries. You were intentionally excluded. The world tilted on its axis. A trust fund. A hidden, secret fortune that they had been sitting on for years, all while they bled me dry, all while they told me they were struggling, all while they manufactured crises to drain my bank account. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. It was a betrayal so profound, so monstrous, that it almost didn't feel real. They hadn't just taken my money, they had stolen my reality. They had built my entire life on a foundation of lies, casting me as the savior in a play where I was the only one who didn't know the ending. Now I had the truth. It was a weapon, and I was finally ready to use it. The game had changed. They thought they had me cornered, that I would crumble under legal pressure. They had no idea that I was about to walk into the courtroom and set off a bomb. Armed with the information from my aunt, I felt a seismic shift in my own emotional landscape. The grief and confusion that had been swirling inside me solidified into something cold, hard and sharp, resolve. I was no longer a victim reacting to their attacks. I was a strategist planning my counter-offensive. Liam and I spent the weekend digging, with my Aunt Carol pointing us in the right direction. She gave us the name of the bank that managed the trust and the approximate date it was established. The digital age is a difficult time to keep major financial secrets, especially from a determined CPA with a grudge. It didn't take long to find the breadcrumbs. Public records, property deeds transferred into the trust's name, business filings for shell corporations my father had set up. It was a complex web of financial entities designed to obscure the truth, but the pattern was clear. They weren't just solvent, they were wealthy. The house I had saved from foreclosure was owned outright by the trust. The European vacations Dylan took, the designer clothes my mother wore, the endless string of failed business ventures, it was all funded by a secret reservoir of money they had deliberately and maliciously concealed from me. The final, damning piece of evidence came from an old box of my grandmother's things that Aunt Carol had kept. Tucked away in a photo album was a letter from my grandfather to his lawyer, dated a few months before he passed away. In it, he laid out his intentions for the trust with heartbreaking clarity. He wrote of his love for both his sons, but also of his deep and abiding concern for my father's profound lack of character and fiscal responsibility. He stated explicitly that the trust was to be structured for the benefit of my father and his male heir, Dylan. The letter included one devastating line about me. His daughter, Evelyn, has a good head on her shoulders. She will make her own way. It is perhaps for the best that she is not entangled in her father's affairs. My own grandfather had written me off. He had seen the dysfunction, the impending train wreck of my father's life, and his solution was not to fix it, but to protect his assets and sacrifice his granddaughter to the wolves. He thought he was saving me from being entangled, but what he had actually done was sign my death warrant. He had made me the designated sacrifice, the financial and emotional caretaker for two grown men who were secretly millionaires. They had a safety net woven from gold, and they used my meager savings as their personal trampoline. The rage I felt was so pure, so intense, it was almost sublime. It burned away all the years of guilt, of self-doubt, of feeling like I was never enough. I wasn't the crazy one. I wasn't the selfish one. I wasn't the one who didn't understand family. They were. They were the monsters in this story. On the day of our first court appearance for the eviction hearing, I walked in feeling not nervous, but electrified. My parents and Dylan were already there, sitting with their expensive lawyer. They looked smug, confident. My mother shot me a look of deep, theatrical sorrow, a last-ditch attempt at emotional manipulation. I met her gaze and felt nothing but ice. They had no idea what was coming. The proceedings began, their lawyer laying out their fraudulent claim, painting a picture of me as a fickle daughter who had reneged on a generous family arrangement. Miss Albright listened patiently, letting him finish. Then it was her turn. She stood up, her voice calm and clear. "Your Honor, we are here today to discuss a fraudulent eviction claim. But this claim is just the latest act in a long and calculated history of financial and emotional abuse perpetrated by the plaintiffs against my client." Their lawyer objected immediately. "This is a simple landlord-tenant dispute, Your Honor. Counsel is trying to muddy the waters with irrelevant family drama." "On the contrary," Miss Albright said, her voice dropping slightly, "it is entirely relevant, it speaks to motive, and to prove that, I would like to submit into evidence a copy of the last will and testament of Gerald and Eleanor Thompson, and the founding documents of the Thompson Family Irrevocable Trust." She placed a thick stack of papers on the clerk's desk. I watched my father's face. The smug confidence drained away, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed panic. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Dylan just looked confused, as if he was trying to work out a particularly difficult math problem. The room was silent except for the rustling of paper as the judge looked through the documents. He read for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he looked up, peering over his glasses, first at my father, then at me. His expression was one of utter contempt. And in that moment, I knew I had won. Not just the condo, not just the legal battle. I had won my life back. The truth was out, a bright, searing light that was about to incinerate the whole rotten structure of their lies. The judge's chambers felt like a vacuum-sealed container of tension. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and the low hum of a computer monitor. My parents, Dylan, their lawyer, Miss Albright, and I were all seated around a large, polished table. The judge, a man with a tired face and eyes that had clearly seen every flavor of human depravity, stared at the trust documents spread before him. He then looked at my father, a long, silent, withering stare that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. "Mr. Thompson," the judge began, his voice dangerously soft, "I have in front of me a motion to evict your daughter from a property she owns. Attached to this motion is a lease agreement which Ms. Albright here contends is a forgery. Then I have these documents, which suggest you and your son are the beneficiaries of a trust fund valued, at a quick glance, in the 7-figure range. A trust fund your daughter was, it seems, entirely unaware of. Perhaps you could enlighten me as to how these two narratives coexist." My father, who had always been so glib, so full of bluster and righteous indignation, seemed to shrink in his chair. He licked his lips, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. His expensive lawyer, a man who clearly realized he'd been fed a mountain of lies, looked as if he'd just swallowed a lemon. "Your Honor," my father stammered, It's a complicated family matter. It's about to get very simple," the judge snapped, his voice like cracking ice. "This court does not appreciate being used as a tool for familial extortion. This eviction claim is not only frivolous, it appears to be malicious and retaliatory. And this lease," he picked it up between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of garbage, "smells like fraud from a mile away." He turned his gaze to my mother. "And you, madam, you were aware of this trust? All while accepting financial support from your daughter, support that appears to have been extracted under false pretenses." My mother began to cry, but they weren't the performative, manipulative tears I was used to. These were the panicked, ugly sobs of someone who had been caught. She didn't say a word, just covered her face with her hands. Dylan, in a moment of what I can only describe as terminal stupidity, decided to speak up. "Look, it was for her own good," he said, his voice earnest. "She's always been so uptight, so obsessed with money and saving. We didn't want to burden her with the knowledge of the trust. We wanted her to build character." The sheer, unmitigated gall of that statement left everyone in the room speechless for a moment. Even the judge seemed taken aback. He slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Thompson," he said to Dylan, his voice dripping with incredulity, "are you suggesting that you and your parents perpetrated a multi-decade-long financial deception, culminating in an attempt to fraudulently seize your sister's home as a character-building exercise?" Well, when you put it like that, Dylan mumbled, finally realizing he had made a catastrophic error. Miss Albright, seeing her opening, leaned forward. Your Honor, my client is prepared to press criminal charges for the forgery and to initiate a civil suit for the recovery of all monies obtained under false pretenses with interest. We estimate the total to be in excess of $300,000, not accounting for punitive damages for emotional distress. The color drained completely from my father's face. The threat of civil litigation was bad enough, but the specter of criminal charges, of actual jail time, had clearly never entered his bubble of entitlement. He thought he could bully and sue his way back into control, but he had miscalculated spectacularly. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, and Miss Albright had just revealed her bazooka. However, she continued smoothly, Miss Thompson is a reasonable woman. She has no desire for a protracted and painful public spectacle that would further damage this already fractured family. This was the part Liam and I had rehearsed with her for hours. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about extraction. I wanted out, completely and irrevocably. I wanted to sever the limb, to save the body. My client is willing to forego all legal action, both civil and criminal, on 3 conditions, Miss Albright stated. 1. The immediate and permanent withdrawal of this eviction suit. 2. The signing of a legally binding document, a no-contact agreement, stipulating that the plaintiffs will never again attempt to contact, harass, or solicit my client in any way, shape, or form for the rest of their natural lives. 3. She paused for dramatic effect. A full and complete financial separation, a legal release from any and all future filial responsibility, real or imagined. The room was silent. My parents and brother were staring at me, their expressions a cocktail of shock, hatred, and dawning comprehension. They were finally understanding the new reality. The bank was closed. The ATM was out of service permanently. The game was over, and they had lost. The silence in the judge's chambers stretched, thick and suffocating. My father stared at Miss Albright's proposed terms, his face a mask of disbelief. The idea of no longer having access to me, to my resources, was clearly more terrifying to him than the threat of jail. It was a complete upending of his universe. He had always been the one in control, the puppet master pulling the strings of guilt and obligation. Now, the puppet was cutting her own strings and walking off the stage. "This is ridiculous," he finally sputtered, turning to the judge with a desperate, pleading look. "She's my daughter. You can't just sever a family. It's unnatural." "What's unnatural, Mr. Thompson?" the judge replied, his voice cold as steel, "is what you've done. You have systematically exploited your daughter for decades while concealing a significant fortune from her. You have lied, you have manipulated, and when she finally stood up for herself, you attempted to use this court to fraudulently steal her home. Frankly, the terms Ms. Loss has won. Albright has proposed are far more generous than you deserve. If I were in your daughter's position, we'd be discussing restitution and a lengthy prison sentence for fraud and perjury." The judge's words hung in the air, a final, brutal condemnation. My father deflated, all the bluster and arrogance leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He looked old, small, and pathetic. He exchanged a panicked look with my mother, who was still weeping silently, and Dylan, who just looked like a lost child. Their lawyer, seeing the writing on the wall, and likely wanting to distance himself from this train wreck as quickly as possible, leaned in and whispered urgently to my father. I couldn't hear what he said, but the effect was immediate. My father slumped in his chair, a man utterly defeated. He gave a curt, jerky nod. "We agree," he mumbled, not looking at me. "We agree to the terms." The rest of the meeting was a blur of legal paperwork. Miss Albright, ever prepared, had already drafted the no-contact agreement and the release of filial responsibility. I watched as my parents and brother signed the documents, their signatures, the same ones they had so easily forged, now legally binding them to stay out of my life forever. It was a surreal moment. With a few strokes of a pen, 30 years of toxic obligation were erased. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. There was no triumphant surge of joy, no satisfying rush of vengeance. There was just a quiet, profound sense of release. It was the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying until it was gone. As we filed out of the judge's chambers, my mother made one last, desperate attempt. She reached out to touch my arm, her face streaked with tears. "Evelyn, please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't do this. We're your family." I stopped and looked at her. Really looked at her, perhaps for the first time without the filter of obligation and guilt. I saw a weak, selfish woman who had chosen her own comfort over her daughter's well-being at every turn. A woman who had stood by and watched as her husband and son bled me dry, and who had actively participated in the deception. I felt no anger, no hatred. I just felt a deep, cavernous pity. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady. "You're not anymore." I gently removed her hand from my arm and walked away without looking back. Liam was waiting for me in the hallway. He didn't say anything, just wrapped me in his arms. I buried my face in his chest and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. The legal battle was over, but I knew the emotional war was just beginning. I had to mourn the family I thought I had, the family I had spent my whole life trying to earn the love of. I had to come to terms with the fact that it had all been a lie. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time it was my road. I was free. Free from the endless emergencies, the guilt trips, the emotional blackmail. Free to build a life with Liam, a life based on mutual respect, honesty, and genuine, unconditional love. The price of that freedom had been high. It had cost me my family, but as Liam held me in the sterile quiet of the courthouse hallway, I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was a price worth paying. I had lost a family, but I had finally found myself. The days following the court hearing were strange. The silence from my former family was absolute. My phone, which for years had been a constant source of anxiety with its endless barrage of demands and manufactured crises, was now quiet. It was an unnerving piece, and I found myself flinching every time it buzzed, a Pavlovian response to years of conditioning. The habit of being on high alert was hard to break. Liam was my anchor through it all. He understood that my liberation wasn't a single, triumphant event, but a process. He gave me space to grieve, to be angry, to be confused. He listened without judgment as I talked through the years of manipulation, re-examining memories through the new, harsh lens of the truth. Little things would trigger a fresh wave of anger or sadness. A song on the radio that my mother used to love. Seeing a car like the one I'd bought for Dylan. Each memory was now tainted, a scene from a life that was built on a lie. Aunt Carol became an unexpected source of comfort. We spoke on the phone regularly, and she filled in the gaps in my family's history, telling me stories about my grandparents and my father's childhood that painted a clearer picture of how the dysfunction had taken root. She spoke of my father's insatiable need for admiration and his utter lack of empathy, a pattern that had been evident even when he was a boy. She told me how my grandparents had enabled him, always cleaning up his messes, a cycle that my parents had simply replicated with Dylan. Hearing these stories didn't excuse their behavior, but it did contextualize it. It helped me understand that their cruelty wasn't entirely personal. I wasn't the cause of their brokenness. I was just the most convenient casualty. I was the one they had chosen to carry the burden of their own inadequacies. One of the hardest things to process was the role my grandfather had played. His letter, with its casual dismissal of my future, was a deep wound. He had seen the truth about my father, and instead of confronting it, he had simply written me off. He had chosen to protect his money over protecting his granddaughter. It was a cold, pragmatic decision that had shaped the entire course of my life. I had to let go of the idealized image I had of him, the kind, hard-working man from my father's stories, and accept the reality of a man who had chosen to sacrifice me. My own healing came in stages. First, there was the rage, a white-hot fury that I allowed myself to feel fully for the first time. I was angry at them for their lies, their greed, their cruelty. But I was also angry at myself, for my blindness, for my willingness to be their doormat for so long. Miss Albright had advised me that self-blame was common in cases of long-term manipulation, and she was right. It took time, and a few sessions with a good therapist, to understand that my desire to help, my need to keep the peace, were not character flaws. They were normal, human impulses that had been weaponized against me by people who had no conscience. After the anger came the grief. I cried for the mother I never had, the one who would have protected me instead of using me. I cried for the father I thought I knew, the one I had desperately sought approval from. I cried for the brother I had tried so hard to support, only to realize he saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. I was an orphan with living parents, a sister with a living brother. The loneliness of that realization was profound. But slowly, gradually, the grief and anger began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of peace. The silence on my phone was no longer unnerving, it was calming. Waking up in the morning without a feeling of impending doom was a revelation. I started to rediscover myself, the person I was when I wasn't constantly managing someone else's chaos. I had hobbies I'd abandoned, friends I'd neglected. Liam and I started planning our future, a future that was ours and ours alone. We talked about buying a house, about traveling, about starting a family. These were things I had never allowed myself to dream of before, because my resources, financial, emotional, and mental, had always been mortgaged to my family of origin. The freedom was dizzying, exhilarating. It was like learning to breathe after a lifetime of being held underwater. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place about 6 months after the court date. A thick envelope arrived in the mail from Miss Albright. Inside was a cashier's check for $300,000. The enclosed letter was brief. After the court hearing, my father, in a panic and on the advice of his lawyer, had liquidated a portion of the trust and decided to reimburse me for my generosity over the years. It wasn't an apology. There was no note of remorse. It was a legal maneuver, a desperate attempt to shield himself from any potential future lawsuits by claiming he had made me whole. It was a guilt payment, a final transactional admission of his crimes. I looked at the check, at the neat printed numbers, and I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, but it wasn't a bitter one either. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated irony. After all the years of them telling me I was obsessed with money, after all their talk of art and passion and the evils of materialism, it had all come down to this: a check, a payoff, a number. They had proven, in the end, that money was the only thing they had ever truly understood. Staring at the check, I felt a strange sense of vindication that was entirely separate from the money itself. It was the proof. It was the black and white, undeniable admission of guilt that I knew I would never receive in words. They hadn't sent it out of remorse. They had sent it out of fear. Fear of the consequences I now represented. For the first time, they were afraid of me. The power dynamic had been permanently, irrevocably reversed. Liam and I sat down at our small kitchen table, the check lying between us like a strange alien artifact. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked, his voice gentle. For a moment, I considered tearing it up. It felt like blood money, the product of decades of lies and emotional vampirism. Part of me wanted to reject it, to prove that it had never been about the money for me. But that would have been a lie. It was about the money, because they had made it about the money. They had used my money to control me, to diminish me, to fund their comfortable lives while I struggled. Rejecting the check wouldn't be a noble gesture. It would be one final act of self-sabotage, letting them off the hook for the last time. "We're going to use it to live well," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Living well is the best revenge. We deposited the check the next day. The bank teller's eyes widened slightly at the amount, but to us, it was more than just a number. It was a down payment on a new life. It was seed money for a future, free from their influence. It was the severance package from a job I had never asked for and had finally been fired from. The first thing we did was something I had always considered an impossible luxury. We hired a financial planner. I wanted this money, their money, to be handled with the kind of care and responsibility they had never been capable of. I wanted it to grow, to become a foundation for our future, a legacy of my survival. The planner, a sharp woman with kind eyes, listened to my abbreviated story with a knowing nod. "You'd be surprised how often I hear variations of this," she said. "Financial abuse is the secret weapon of the dysfunctional family. We set up investments, a retirement fund, and a college fund for the children we hope to have one day. Every step was a deliberate act of building a future that they had tried to steal from me. It was an act of defiance. We also decided to do something for ourselves, something purely for joy. We booked a trip to New Zealand, a place I had always dreamed of seeing. For years, every vacation I took was overshadowed by guilt, by the knowledge that I should be saving that money in case of another family emergency. This trip was different. It was a celebration of our freedom. The 2 weeks we spent there were transformative. We hiked on glaciers, kayaked in crystal-clear fjords, and stood on mountainsides that felt like the edge of the world. Surrounded by such vast, impersonal beauty, the drama of my family seemed to shrink. Their lies, their manipulations, their petty cruelties felt small and insignificant against the backdrop of a mountain range that had stood for millennia. I realized how small their world was, a tiny, self-contained ecosystem of dysfunction. And I was finally out. One evening, sitting on the balcony of a small cabin overlooking a lake, I told Liam about the letter from my grandfather. I told him about the pain of being written off, of being sacrificed. He listened patiently, then took my hand. "Your grandfather was wrong about one thing," he said. "He thought he was keeping you from being entangled in your father's affairs. But you were never just entangled. You were the life raft. You kept them all afloat. He didn't see your strength, Evelyn. He just saw a convenient solution. And he underestimated you." His words resonated deep within me. I had always seen my role as a burden, a curse. But Liam was right. It had also been a testament to my strength. I had survived. I had endured decades of abuse and had come out the other side. Not broken, but stronger. I had not just made my own way, as my grandfather had predicted. I had forged it through a storm of lies and betrayal. I returned from that trip with a new sense of perspective. The anger had cooled, leaving behind a hard, clear understanding of who they were and who I was. They were a chapter in my life, a dark and painful one, but it was over. I was the author of my own story now, and I could write any ending I wanted. The check was a tool, a means to an end. It gave us security, it gave us options. But the real wealth I had gained was not the money. It was the freedom, the peace of mind, and the knowledge that I had faced the very worst of my family's darkness and had walked away into the light, whole and unbroken. Life began to settle into a new, peaceful rhythm. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been my companion for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm I had never known. Liam and I bought a house, a small, charming bungalow with a big backyard, in a quiet neighborhood miles away from the city where my family lived. The act of signing the mortgage papers, using the trust money as a down payment, felt like a powerful reclamation. I was taking the wealth they had hoarded and using it to build a place of safety and love, everything my childhood home had not been. We painted the walls, planted a garden, and adopted a goofy, 3-legged rescue dog. Each act of domestic creation was a step further away from the destruction of my past. I found joy in the simple, mundane things: cooking dinner with Liam, walking the dog in the evening, reading a book without my phone buzzing with some new, urgent demand. I had to learn how to live without being in a constant state of crisis management. My therapist called it recovering from being the designated adult child. I was learning to be responsible for only one person's happiness, my own. My work at the accounting firm, which had once been a refuge, became a source of genuine satisfaction. Freed from the financial drain of my family, I was able to invest in my own career. I took advanced certification courses, attended conferences, and began to build a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in my firm. My boss, the same woman who had my mother escorted out of the lobby, became a mentor and a friend. She had seen the before, and she celebrated the after with a fierce, protective pride. About a year after the court case, I received a tentative email from Aunt Carol. She had heard through the family grapevine that I had moved and was doing well. She was hesitant, unsure of her welcome, but wanted to reach out. I invited her to visit us in our new home. It was a strange and wonderful weekend. She was a kind, funny, and deeply empathetic woman who had been just as much a victim of my father's narcissism as I had. She had been cast as the bitter, crazy one for daring to stand up to him years ago. We shared our stories, and in doing so, we validated each other's experiences. It was like finding a fellow survivor after a shipwreck. She looked around my sunny, peaceful home, at the pictures of Liam and me on our New Zealand trip, and she smiled. "You did it, Evelyn," she said, her eyes misty. "You got out, you broke the cycle." Having her in my life felt like reclaiming a piece of my family, but on my own terms. She was the family I chose, not the one I was born into. The only communication I had from my former family was indirect. A distant cousin I barely knew sent me a message on social media, telling me that Dylan had been arrested for trying to sell a fake Picasso to an undercover art dealer. He had apparently been trying to fund a new career as a high-end art forger. The sheer predictability of it was almost boring. He was a cliché of entitlement, a boy who had been told he was a genius his whole life, and had never developed the discipline or talent to be anything more than a cheap copy. Later, I heard through another source that my parents had been forced to sell their house, the house I had saved twice to pay for Dylan's legal fees and restitution. The trust, it turned out, had been heavily depleted by years of their lavish spending and my father's bad investments. The secret fortune wasn't infinite after all. They had burned through it, just as they had burned through my savings, my goodwill, and my love. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of something that might have been satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by a profound emptiness. They had had everything: money, security, a daughter who loved them, and they had squandered it all in pursuit of nothing. Theirs was a self-inflicted tragedy, a slow-motion car crash of their own making. I realized that the best revenge wasn't living well. The best revenge was not caring at all. Their drama, their chaos, their inevitable decline had nothing to do with me anymore. I was no longer the audience, the stagehand, or the financial backer of their terrible play. I had left the theatre. Liam and I got married on a sunny afternoon in our backyard. It was a small, intimate ceremony with just a few close friends, my boss and Aunt Carol. There were no grand pronouncements, no performative displays of emotion. Just a simple, heartfelt exchange of vows, a promise to build a life together based on trust, respect, and kindness. As I stood there, holding Liam's hands, with our three-legged dog asleep at our feet, I felt a sense of peace that was so deep and so complete it felt like a physical presence. I had faced the darkness of my past and had chosen to walk into the light. I had learned that family is not about blood, it is about who you choose to love and who chooses to love you back. It's about who shows up, who tells you the truth, and who holds your hand when you're afraid. I had lost the family I was born with, but I had built a new one, a better one, and it was more than I could have ever hoped for. 2 years after our wedding, Liam and I welcomed our first child, a daughter named Grace. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I was overwhelmed by a love so fierce and protective it took my breath away. It was a primal, unconditional love, the kind I had always craved but never received from my own mother. In that moment, looking at my daughter's tiny, perfect face, I made a silent vow. I would be the mother to her that I had never had. She would grow up knowing she was loved for who she was, not for what she could provide. She would be supported, cherished, and protected. The cycle of dysfunction, the legacy of emotional and financial abuse, would end with me. Motherhood was a journey of healing I hadn't expected. Every milestone Grace reached, every time she looked at me with pure, trusting love, it was like a balm on the old wounds of my own childhood. I saw what a healthy parent-child relationship was supposed to look like, and the contrast with my own upbringing was stark and painful, but also incredibly clarifying. It reinforced the rightness of my decision to cut ties. How could I have exposed this beautiful, innocent child to their toxicity? The thought was unbearable. They would never know her. They would never have the chance to manipulate her, to poison her with their twisted definition of family. She was safe, and that was all that mattered. When Grace was a toddler, a registered letter arrived. My hands went cold when I saw the familiar, spidery handwriting of my mother on the return address. For a moment, I was tempted to throw it in the fire, unopened. It was a clear violation of the no-contact order, and I was well within my rights to ignore it. But a morbid curiosity, a need for some kind of final punctuation on that chapter of my life, got the better of me. Liam and I read it together. It was a long, rambling, self-pitying letter. My father had passed away from a sudden heart attack a few months prior. The letter was a maudlin account of his final days, painting him as a misunderstood, tragic figure. My mother wrote of her loneliness, her financial struggles, the remainder of the trust having been wiped out by Dylan's legal troubles, and my father's final, disastrous investment in a line of smart toasters. She wrote about her deep regret, not for what she had done, but for how things had turned out. It was a classic narcissist's apology, a non-apology that was all about her own pain. Then came the real purpose of the letter. Dylan, after a brief stint in a low-security prison, was now living with her. He was unwell, struggling with his mental health, and unable to work. She was old, she was tired, and she didn't know how she could cope. The letter ended with a desperate, thinly veiled plea for me to re-establish contact, to step back into my old role as the family savior. There was even a line that read, "A granddaughter should know her grandmother, her only family." The audacity was breathtaking. After everything they had done, after trying to steal my home, after years of lies and manipulation, she was trying one last time to reel me back in. She was using my father's death and my own daughter as emotional blackmail. I read the letter, and I felt nothing. The old triggers, the familiar pangs of guilt and obligation, were gone. It was like reading a letter from a stranger, a sad, pathetic stranger whose life had no bearing on my own. I saw her not as my mother, but as an addict, hopelessly hooked on a drug of drama and dependency. And I was her drug of choice. I walked to the fireplace, the letter in my hand. Liam watched me, his expression supportive but unreadable. He knew this was my decision. I held the letter over the flames, and I let it go. We watched it curl, turn black, and disappear into ash. There was no anger, no ceremony. It was just a final act of release, a final closing of a door that had been shut and locked for years. My father was gone. My mother and brother were trapped in a prison of their own making, a codependent nightmare from which they would likely never escape. Their story was over. Mine was just beginning. It was a story of love, of healing, of breaking a toxic legacy and building a new one. It was the story of Grace, my daughter, who would grow up knowing only unconditional love and support. My family of origin had tried to write my story for me, to cast me as a minor character, a means to an end. But I had taken the pen back, and I was writing a much, much better story. The act of burning my mother's letter was a definitive moment. It wasn't done in anger, but with a quiet finality. It was a physical manifestation of the boundary I had set years ago, a boundary that was now forged in steel. There was no temptation to respond, no flicker of the old guilt. There was only the calm, certain knowledge that I had done the right thing for myself, for Liam, and most importantly, for Grace. I never wanted my daughter to feel the way I had felt, like a resource to be tapped, a utility to be used. I wanted her to feel cherished. Her existence would be her own, not a supporting role in someone else's drama. My own journey with motherhood continued to be a powerful antidote to my past. I made a conscious effort to do the opposite of what my parents had done. I listened to Grace. I validated her feelings, even when they were inconvenient. I celebrated her small achievements with genuine joy. I apologized when I made a mistake. These simple acts of parental decency felt revolutionary. I was actively rewiring my own brain, creating new neural pathways of love and respect that had been absent in my own upbringing. Liam was an incredible partner in this. He had come from a warm, supportive, and refreshingly normal family. Spending time with his parents was a revelation. They were kind, they were interested in my life, and their love for Liam was evident in everything they did. They had no ulterior motives, no hidden agendas. They were just parents. They became the grandparents Grace deserved, showering her with affection and wisdom without any strings attached. Being welcomed into their family felt like finding a safe harbor after a lifetime at sea in a leaky boat. My career continued to flourish. I eventually left the accounting firm and started my own consulting business, specializing in forensic accounting for messy family disputes and estate battles. My personal experience gave me a unique insight, a kind of superpower. I could spot financial manipulation and gaslighting from a mile away. I could read between the lines of a trust document and see the hidden resentments and power plays. I became a fierce advocate for my clients, many of whom were women in situations eerily similar to my own. I helped them untangle the financial webs that had been woven to trap them, and I empowered them to reclaim their independence. The work was challenging, but deeply rewarding. It was my own way of turning my pain into a purpose. Every time I helped a client secure her financial freedom, it felt like I was healing another small piece of myself. I was taking the darkness of my past and using it to bring light to others. I rarely thought about my mother and brother. They existed in a different universe, a place I had no desire to revisit. Aunt Carol would occasionally pass on a piece of third-hand information. My mother had sold the last of her jewelry. Dylan had tried to start a GoFundMe for his chronic artistic sensitivity, which was shut down for fraud. Their world continued to shrink, a slow, sad implosion of entitlement and decay. I felt no joy in their demise, only a distant, clinical pity. They were a cautionary tale, a perfect example of how a life without accountability, without empathy, without love, will eventually consume itself. They had been given every advantage, including a secret fortune, and had turned it all to dust. I, on the other hand, had been given nothing but obstacles, and I had built a life of abundance. Not just financial abundance, but an abundance of love, joy, and peace. My greatest triumph was not the discovery of the trust fund or the victory in court. It was the quiet, happy life I had built in the aftermath. It was a life that was so full, so rich, that there was simply no room left for the ghosts of the past. One evening, as I was tucking an older, elementary school-aged Grace into bed, she looked up at me with her serious, thoughtful eyes. "Mommy," she said, "you're the best mommy in the whole world." I kissed her forehead, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. "And you," I whispered, "are the best daughter in the whole world." In that simple, honest exchange, I found my ultimate vindication. The pain, the betrayal, the long, hard fight for freedom, it had all been worth it. It had led me here, to this moment, to this love. It had made me the mother I was, the woman I had become. My family had told me I was too young to understand. But I had finally understood the most important thing of all, that true wealth has nothing to do with a hidden trust fund. It's about the love you build, the peace you find, and the future you create for yourself, on your own terms. The years passed, and the life Liam and I built became a sturdy, beautiful structure. Grace grew into a bright, funny, and remarkably well-adjusted teenager, her confidence a testament to a childhood free from the kind of emotional manipulation I had endured. My consulting business was a resounding success. I'd become a go-to expert in my niche, even co-authoring a book on identifying and combating financial abuse within families. The irony was not lost on me. I was using the very skills I'd been forced to develop for survival and turning them into a professional asset. My past was no longer a source of pain, but a foundation of expertise. Aunt Carol remained a cherished part of our lives, a constant, loving presence. She was the grandmother Grace knew and adored, the keeper of the family stories that were worth remembering, the ones of resilience and kindness, not the ones of greed and deceit. Through her, I was able to reclaim a part of my heritage without having to embrace the toxicity that had come with it. The final, definitive end to the chapter of my origin family came, not with a letter or a phone call, but with a sterile, impersonal email from a county administrator. It was a notification regarding an unclaimed body at the city morgue, my mother. The email was a standard form letter, sent to me because a search of public records had identified me as the next of kin. She had died alone in a low-income apartment, apparently of natural causes. Dylan, the notice said, was unaccounted for. There was a box to check if I wished to claim the remains. My hand hovered over the mouse for a long moment. There was no surge of grief, no flicker of anger. There was just a profound and weary sadness. A sadness for the woman she could have been, for the mother she had chosen not to be. She had died as she had lived, isolated by her own selfishness, a victim of the world she had created. I thought about the cycle of it all. My grandfather, seeing the flaws in his son, had tried to engineer a solution with money, and in doing so, had created a monster of entitlement and had sacrificed me. My father, in turn, had poured all his resources and adoration into his own son, creating another, weaker version of himself. My mother had been the willing accomplice, enabling their worst instincts because it was easier than confronting the truth. It was a dynasty of dysfunction, and I was the one who had escaped. I thought about what claiming her body would entail. A funeral, a memorial. It would be an act of hypocrisy. To stand before a handful of distant relatives and pretend to mourn a relationship that had been a hollow sham would be the final lie in a lifetime of them. I owed her nothing. My debts had been paid long ago, in cash, in tears, in years of my life I could never get back. I moved the cursor and checked the box that read, "I decline to claim the remains." It was a cold, clinical act, but it was also an honest one. My relationship with her had ended years ago in a judge's chambers. This was just the biological postscript. I closed the email and went to find Liam. He was in the backyard, helping Grace with her chemistry homework. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the garden we had planted together. I stood for a moment, just watching them, my two favorite people in the world, living this beautiful, ordinary, peaceful life that I had fought so hard for. Liam looked up and saw me, and his face broke into a warm smile. He knew, without me saying a word, that something had happened. He just opened his arm, and I went to him, sinking into the comfort of his embrace, with our daughter right there beside us. In that moment, surrounded by the love and safety of the family I had chosen, the family I had built, I knew I had made the right decision. My mother's story was over. But mine, the one I was still writing every day, was filled with light. A few weeks after I received the email about my mother, my book was featured in a national magazine. The article included a short, sanitized version of my backstory, difficult family situation, that led to my expertise in forensic accounting. The publicity brought a new wave of clients, but it also brought something unexpected. A man claiming to be Dylan's former cellmate contacted my office. My assistant, a formidable woman who guarded my time like a dragon, was ready to dismiss him as a crank, but the details he provided were so specific, so chillingly accurate, that she put him through to me. The man, who called himself Skeeter, was a low-level con artist doing time for check fraud. He had been in the same minimum security facility as Dylan for about 6 months. His call wasn't a threat or an attempt at extortion. It was, bizarrely, a warning. "Your brother's a piece of work, lady," Skeeter said, his voice raspy. "Not like the rest of us. We're mostly just dumb, you know. He's different. He's got this poison in him. He talked about you all the time, not like a brother talks about a sister. He talked about you like you were something he owned, something that was stolen from him." Skeeter went on to recount the stories Dylan had told, a twisted, delusional version of our family history. In Dylan's version, he was the prodigal son, the misunderstood genius, and I was the cold, calculating villain who had been corrupted by my husband and had stolen the family fortune. He believed, with a religious fervor, that the trust fund, my home, my successor of it, rightfully belonged to him. He saw me not just as a sister who had cut him off, but as the architect of his downfall. The most chilling part was what Skeeter said last. He got out about a month ago. And the last thing he said to me was, "I'm going to go get what's mine. Evelyn owes me." The guy's not right in the head, lady. He's got this weird, shiny look in his eyes when he talks about you. You need to watch your back. The call ended, leaving a profound sense of unease in its wake. For years I had viewed Dylan as a pathetic, incompetent fool, a harmless leech. But Skeeter's words painted a different picture. One of a man whose lifelong entitlement had curdled into a dangerous, narcissistic rage. He had lost everything. His money, his status, his parents who had enabled him, and in his warped mind, I was the one to blame. I had become the sole focus of his resentment. I immediately took action. I hired a private security firm to do a threat assessment on my home and office. I installed a state-of-the-art security system. I gave a picture of Dylan to Grace's school and to my local police department, along with a copy of the no-contact order. These were precautions I never dreamed I would have to take. I had freed myself from my family financially and emotionally, but now I was facing the possibility of a physical threat. It was a terrifying new dimension to the nightmare. Liam was stoic and supportive, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We had built this beautiful, safe life, and now a spectre from my past was threatening to shatter it. We had difficult conversations with Grace, explaining in age-appropriate terms that there was a person from Mummy's past who was not well and that we needed to be extra careful for a while. It was a conversation no parent should ever have to have. The freedom I had cherished for so long suddenly felt fragile. I found myself looking over my shoulder in the grocery store, scanning faces in a crowd, my old hypervigilance returning with a vengeance. The ghost I thought I had exorcised was back, and this time, it might be real. The security consultant, a former FBI agent, gave me some sobering advice. Men like your brother, who believe they are owed something, are the most unpredictable. He has nothing left to lose. Don't underestimate him just because he's been a failure his whole life. A cornered rat can still be dangerous. The long, quiet war I thought I had won was suddenly not over. There was one final battle to be fought, and the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about money or freedom anymore. It was about protecting my daughter, my husband, and the life I had built from the ashes of my past. The peace I had worked so hard to achieve was now under siege, and I had no choice but to fight back. The weeks following the phone call from Skeeter were a tense, surreal exercise in what the security consultant called hardening the target. Our home, once a sanctuary of peace, now bristled with cameras and motion sensors. We established routines and code words. Grace, with the terrifying adaptability of youth, quickly learned the new rules. Don't answer the door, always have her phone on, and call me the moment she felt unsafe. The innocence of our lives had been punctured. The threat of Dylan was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every unfamiliar car on our street, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was living in a fortress of my own making, a prisoner of my brother's phantom rage. But I refused to let fear dictate my life. I continued to work, to see my friends, to live as normally as possible. To do otherwise would be to give him a victory he hadn't earned. The security consultant, a calm and methodical man named Mr. Corbin, was a reassuring presence. He and his team conducted a thorough investigation, trying to locate Dylan. He had fallen completely off the grid. No driver's license, no credit cards, no social security activity. He was a ghost, which, Corbin explained, made him more dangerous. He was likely living in the cash-based underworld of transient shelters and under-the-table jobs. "He's out there," Corbin said during one of our weekly check-ins. "But he's not a master criminal, Mrs. Thompson. He's an amateur fueled by resentment. Amateurs make mistakes." The mistake came about 2 months after the initial warning. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was on a conference call in my home office when my security system pinged my phone with an alert. A motion sensor had been triggered at the far end of our property, near the wooded area that bordered our backyard. I pulled up the live feed on my monitor, my heart pounding. The camera showed a figure, partially obscured by trees. A man in a dirty hoodie, his face gaunt and unshaven, was standing just beyond our fence line, staring at my house. It was Dylan. He looked nothing like the preening, pampered brother I remembered. He was thin, haggard, with a desperate, feral look in his eyes. But the most terrifying thing was his stillness. He was just watching, motionless, like a predator studying its prey. I immediately hit the silent alarm that alerted Corbin's team and the local police. I locked my office door and called Liam, my voice trembling as I told him to stay at his office and not to come home. Then I ran upstairs to Grace's room, my mind racing. She was at a friend's house after school, thank God. She was safe. I crouched by the window in her room, the one that overlooked the backyard, and peered through the blinds. He was still there, a statue of pure malice at the edge of my property. He hadn't tried to climb the fence or approach the house. He was just watching. It was a psychological game, an act of intimidation. He wanted me to know he was there, that he could reach me. He wanted me to be afraid, and I was. I was terrified. But as I watched him, a different emotion began to surface, pushing through the fear, a white-hot, protective rage. This was my home, my daughter's home, the sanctuary I had built. And he was standing at its edge, trying to poison it with his presence. The police arrived first, silent and efficient. They fanned out, approaching from the sides. Dylan must have heard them, because he turned and bolted, disappearing back into the woods. Corbin's team arrived moments later, securing the perimeter and sweeping the area. They found a small makeshift campsite about 100 yards into the woods. He had been living there, watching us, for at least a few days. They found a backpack containing a few clothes, some scraps of food, and a notebook. The notebook was filled with pages and pages of my name, written over and over, and rambling, incoherent manifestos about the injustice that had been done to him. It was the diary of a man who had completely detached from reality. The police put out an APB, but he was gone, vanished back into the shadows. That night, with private security guards stationed outside my house, Liam held me as I finally let myself break down. The reality of the threat was no longer a phantom. It was real. We had seen him. He had been just yards from our home. "We have to end this," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. "I can't live like this. Grace can't live like this." The next morning, I met with Corbin. He laid out the options. We could continue to live in our hardened fortress, waiting for him to make another move. Or we could go on the offensive. "He's predictable," Corbin said. "His entire life has been about one thing: money. He thinks you have his money. We can use that." Corbin proposed a plan, a trap. It was risky, and it would mean confronting my brother directly. But it was the only way to put a definitive end to the threat, to lure the rat out of the shadows and into a cage. For the sake of my daughter's safety and my own sanity, it was a risk I had to take. The plan Mr. Corbin devised was a calculated risk, a piece of psychological bait designed to prey on Dylan's lifelong greed and his profound lack of foresight. It was elegant in its simplicity. We would leak a piece of disinformation through a channel we knew he monitored. Skeeter, Dylan's former cellmate, had mentioned that my brother obsessively followed the social media accounts of a few distant cousins, the only family members who hadn't blocked him, likely out of a morbid curiosity. He used fake profiles, but he was a lurker, desperate for any scrap of information about the world he felt he had been exiled from. The bait was this. One of these cousins would post a vague but intriguing message about my upcoming liquidation of assets in preparation for a permanent expatriate move to a country with no extradition treaty. The post would hint at a large cash transaction, a final tying up of loose ends that would be taking place at my downtown office building on a specific date and time. It was a story designed to hit all of Dylan's buttons: the idea that I was running away with his money, the allure of a large amount of untraceable cash, and a specific, tangible opportunity to get what he believed was his. Corbin's team would work with the police to set up a sting operation. The office building would be swarming with plainclothes officers. The cash would be a briefcase full of paper, and I would be nowhere near the building. The goal was to arrest him for violating the no-contact order, but in a controlled environment where he couldn't harm anyone. The days leading up to the sting were the most stressful of my life. The cousin, a kind woman who I had reconnected with in the wake of my family's implosion, agreed to post the message. The digital bait was cast. Now all we could do was wait and see if the fish would bite. The night before the scheduled sting, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my darkened living room, watching the infrared feeds from the security cameras, a habit I had developed over the past few months. I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. I was willingly inviting this monster back into my orbit, even at a distance, in the hopes of trapping him for good. It felt like I was tempting fate. Liam sat with me, holding my hand, his quiet strength a constant comfort. "What if he doesn't show up?" I whispered. "What if he sees it's a trap?" "Then Corbin's team will find another way," he said. "This ends, Evelyn. One way or another, it ends. We're not going to live in fear forever." The day of the sting, I was a wreck. Corbin had insisted I stay home, monitored by two of his best men. Grace was safely at Liam's parents' house. I paced my living room, my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the call. The minutes ticked by like hours. The time of the transaction came and went. Silence. My heart sank. He hadn't taken the bait. He was smarter than we thought. He was still out there, a phantom threat, and now he knew we were actively trying to catch him. The despair was a cold, heavy weight in my chest. Then my phone rang. It was Corbin. "He's here," he said, his voice calm and professional. "But not where we expected. He didn't go into the office building. He's across the street." He was watching. The team is moving in on him now. I ran to my office and pulled up the public traffic camera feeds for that intersection, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I found the right camera just as it was happening. I saw him. He was standing in an alleyway, trying to blend in with the shadows, his eyes fixed on the entrance to my office building. He looked like a cornered animal. Then, from both ends of the alley, the plainclothes officers appeared. They moved in fast. Dylan's head whipped around, his face a mask of panicked disbelief. For a moment, it looked like he was going to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. He raised his hands in surrender, a pathetic, defeated figure. They put him in cuffs and led him to an unmarked car. As they passed under a streetlight, the camera caught a clear view of his face. He looked directly into the camera, as if he knew I was watching. And in his eyes I saw no remorse, no understanding. I saw only a bottomless, venomous hatred. A hatred that was directed entirely at me. It was over. He was in custody. The immediate threat was gone, but looking at his face on that screen, I knew that the hatred, the poison that Skeeter had talked about, would never go away. They could lock him up, but they couldn't fix what was broken inside him. He would always hate me, because it was easier to hate me than to face the truth of his own pathetic, wasted life. The relief I felt was immense, but it was tinged with a deep, chilling sadness. My brother, the boy I had grown up with, was gone. In his place was a monster, and I had just helped to put him in a cage. The arrest was the beginning of the end, but it wasn't the clean, simple conclusion I had hoped for. Dylan was charged with stalking and multiple violations of a restraining order. Given his prior convictions and the mountain of evidence against him, the notebook, the campsite, the witness testimony from Skeeter, and his presence at the sting, was denied bail. The immediate danger had passed, but now came the legal fallout. The district attorney's office contacted me. They wanted to pursue the maximum sentence. To do that, they needed my full cooperation, including a victim impact statement and my testimony at trial. The thought of facing him in court, of looking at him across a room and recounting the terror he had inflicted on my family, was daunting. Part of me wanted to say no, to let the system handle it and retreat back into the safety of my life. But I knew I couldn't. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about ensuring he could never harm anyone else. It was about seeing this through to its final, definitive conclusion. The months leading up to the trial were emotionally draining. I worked with the prosecutors, providing them with a detailed history of the financial abuse, the eviction attempt, the harassment, the full, ugly tapestry of my family's pathology. It was painful to revisit, but each document, each anecdote, added another bar to the cage he deserved to be in. The process also forced me to confront the full scope of his delusion. His public defender had requested a psychiatric evaluation. The report was a chilling read. It detailed a severe narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid delusions. He was, in the clinical sense, pathologically incapable of empathy or accountability. He genuinely believed his own twisted narrative in which he was the victim and I was the villain. He had convinced himself that I possessed a stolen inheritance and that his actions were a justified attempt to reclaim what was his. Reading the report was strangely liberating. It confirmed what I had known for years. This wasn't a family dispute. It wasn't a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a deeply disturbed individual who was incapable of reason. There was nothing I could have said or done differently. No amount of kindness or generosity would have ever been enough. His emptiness was a black hole that could never be filled. The day of the trial arrived. As I walked into the courtroom, my heart was hammering, but my resolve was firm. Liam was by my side, a silent, steadfast presence. Aunt Carol was in the public gallery, her expression a mixture of sorrow and support. I avoided looking at the defendant's table. I didn't want to see him until I had to. When I took the stand, I focused on the prosecutor, a sharp, compassionate woman who guided me through my testimony. I spoke in a clear, steady voice, recounting the events factually and without emotion. I described the forged lease, the threatening calls, the discovery of the campsite, the fear I felt for my daughter's safety. I was determined not to cry, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing my pain. The hardest part was the cross-examination. Dylan's public defender, a young, earnest man who was clearly just doing his job, tried to paint me as a vindictive sister, a wealthy woman trying to punish her less fortunate brother. He brought up the trust fund, implying that I had unfairly cut Dylan off from his rightful inheritance. The prosecutor had warned me this would happen. "He's going to try to put you on trial," she'd said. "Don't take the bait." I answered his questions calmly, sticking to the facts. "Yes, There was a trust. No, I was not a beneficiary. In fact, its existence was hidden from me for my entire adult life, during which time my brother and parents solicited hundreds of thousands of dollars from me under the false pretense of poverty. My voice was even, my tone matter-of-fact. I laid out the truth without embellishment. I could feel the jury listening, their eyes fixed on me. They weren't just hearing the details of a stalking case, they were hearing the prequel, the long and sordid history that had led us all to this room. The public defender had no further questions. He had tried to introduce a sliver of doubt, to paint a picture of a simple family squabble over money. But the facts were too stark, too ugly. I had the receipts, both literal and emotional. I stepped down from the stand and walked back to my seat next to Liam, my legs feeling steadier than they had on the way up. I had spoken my truth, under oath, and the world had not ended. I had survived. The final part of the trial was my victim impact statement, read to the judge before sentencing. I had written and rewritten it dozens of times. This was my final word, my last communication, direct or indirect, that I would ever have with the man who was my brother. When the time came, I stood and walked to the podium, my hands resting on the worn wood. I did not look at Dylan. I addressed the judge, but my words were for the record, for myself, for the part of me that had been silenced for so long. Your Honor, I began, my voice clear and strong. For 30 years, the defendant, Dylan Thompson, was a central figure in my life. I was taught that it was my job to support him, to enable him, to absorb the consequences of his choices. This was a job I performed diligently, at great personal and financial cost. But this case is not about the money he took. It's about what he tried to take when the money ran out. He tried to take my peace. He tried to take my safety. He tried to take my daughter's right to feel secure in her own home. I paused, taking a breath. The man who camped in the woods behind my house, who filled a notebook with my name, who forced me to turn my home into a fortress, is not a victim of a family dispute. He is a predator who has lost his prey. He is not unwell in a way that deserves sympathy. He is unwell in a way that is dangerous. He believes he is entitled to my life, and he has proven he will go to any lengths to reclaim what he believes is his. I am here today to ask the court to recognize this threat. I am asking for a sentence that will ensure that I will never again have to look over my shoulder, that my daughter will never have to learn escape routes from her own bedroom. I am asking for my freedom. A freedom he has already stolen from me for far too long. I finished and returned to my seat. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to the system. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was a formality, but hearing the foreman say the words, "guilty on all counts," was a moment of profound release. A quiet sob escaped Aunt Carol in the gallery. Liam's hand tightened around mine. I chanced to look at Dylan. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the jury, his expression not one of remorse, but of deep personal offense. He looked betrayed, as if he simply could not comprehend a world in which he was being held accountable for his actions. The judge sentenced him a week later. He spoke of the calculated and cruel nature of the psychological torment and the utter lack of remorse. He sentenced Dylan to 10 years in state prison, the maximum allowed by law, with a permanent restraining order to be put in place upon his release. 10 years. It was a decade of safety. A decade for Grace to grow up without this shadow hanging over us. A decade for me to truly, finally heal. As we walked out of the courthouse, the bright afternoon sun felt different. It wasn't just a change in light, it was a change in atmosphere. The weight that I had carried for my entire life, the weight of their needs, their lies, their chaos, was finally and completely gone. Liam wrapped his arm around my shoulders, and the three of us, me, him, and Aunt Carol walked down the steps and into the rest of our lives. The war was over, and we had won. Life after the trial was not a sudden, cinematic explosion of joy, but a slow, quiet unfurling of peace. The security cameras came down. The code words faded from use. Grace's childhood returned to a state of normal, boring safety. The absence of fear was a tangible presence in our home, a gentle quiet that settled into all the corners of our lives. For the first time, I felt like I could truly breathe, without the subconscious fear of an impending crisis or a lurking threat. The years Dylan was in prison passed with a surreal swiftness. Grace finished middle school, then high school. My business grew, and Liam was made partner at his firm. We traveled, we hosted backyard barbecues. We lived a life of beautiful, blessed normalcy. We never spoke of him. He was a closed chapter, a ghost that had been exorcised. I did not follow his progress in prison. I didn't know if he was a model prisoner or a problem inmate. I didn't care. He had ceased to exist for me on the day he was sentenced. He was a stranger, a name from a past life that no longer had any power over me. When Grace was a senior in high school, preparing to go off to college, I was sorting through a box of old photos for her graduation party. I came across a picture from my own childhood. In it, a small, pigtailed version of me was holding hands with a slightly older, gap-toothed Dylan. We were smiling, standing in front of a garishly decorated Christmas tree. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something, a ghost, of a memory of a time before the poison had fully taken root. I remembered a brother who would share his candy with me, who would let me win at board games. It was a faint, hazy memory, like a dream you can barely recall upon waking. I wondered for a fleeting second, what might have been? What if our parents had been different? What if the trust fund had never existed? Could he have become a good man? It was a useless, unanswerable question. The choices had been made, the paths had been taken. His path had led him to a prison cell. Mine had led me here, to a sunlit room filled with pictures of a happy, well-loved daughter. I put the photo aside, in a small box of things to be discarded. It wasn't my memory anymore. It belonged to a different person, a girl who had believed in a family that never really existed. A few years later, shortly before Dylan's scheduled release, Mr. Corbin, my former security consultant, called me as a professional courtesy. He informed me that Dylan would be paroled in 3 months. He had served 8 years of his 10-year sentence. "He'll have a permanent restraining order," Corbin said. "And he'll have a parole officer. He's unlikely to be an immediate threat, but I wanted you to be aware." I thanked him for the information, my voice calm. The news, which years ago would have sent me into a spiral of panic, was now just information. It was a fact, like the weather report or the price of stocks. It had no emotional hold on me. We took prudent, sensible precautions. We alerted our local police department. I put a picture of him, an updated one from the prison system, in Grace's car. She was in college now, a confident and capable young woman, and I trusted her to be smart and aware. But we did not retreat into a fortress. We did not let his release diminish the peace we had built. He had taken enough of my life. He would not have another second. I had no idea what happened to him after he was released. I made a conscious choice not to know. Whether he drifted back into the criminal underworld, whether he ended up homeless, whether he somehow managed to find a pathetic semblance of a life, it was irrelevant. His story was no longer intertwined with mine. My life was full of love for my husband and my daughter, full of pride in my work, full of friendships and laughter, and the quiet joy of a peaceful evening. The black hole of my family had tried to pull me in, to extinguish my light, but I had escaped its gravity. I had broken free and created my own solar system, a place of warmth and love and unwavering light. What happened in the darkness, far beyond my orbit, was no longer my concern. I was finally, truly, and irrevocably free. Did I go too far by erasing him so completely from my life, or not far enough? Let me know in the comments.